When most people hear the word worship, they picture raised hands in a church service or beautiful hymns echoing through sanctuary walls. But true worship runs deeper than music or Sunday morning rituals. It's the very purpose for which we were created. Jesus told the Samaritan woman at the well, "True worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for the Father is seeking such to worship him." This profound statement reveals something crucial. God actively seeks authentic worshipers. But what makes worship authentic? What separates true worship from mere religious activity? The English word worship comes from an old term meaning worthship, declaring something's worth. When we worship God, we're declaring His supreme worth, acknowledging His rightful place as the center of all things. This explains why the first commandment addresses worship. Our hearts naturally worship something, and God knows we become like whatever we worship. Throughout Scripture, we see worship transforming people's lives. Isaiah encounters God's holiness in worship and receives his prophetic calling. David's psalms of worship carry him through life's darkest valleys. Paul and Silas worship in prison, and chains fall off. Worship isn't just something we do. It's something that does something to us. Modern believers often reduce worship to an event or emotion, but biblical worship encompasses all of life, our thoughts, actions, relationships, and choices. Romans chapter 12, verse 1 calls us to present our bodies as living sacrifices, describing this as our reasonable worship. The heart of worship begins with revelation of who God is. In Isaiah chapter 6, the prophet sees the Lord high and lifted up, and his response is immediate prostration and confession. True worship always flows from encountering God's nature, His holiness, love, power, wisdom, and grace. The better we know Him, the deeper our worship becomes. Scripture reveals various expressions of worship. The Hebrew word shacha means to bow down, showing physical reverence. Yada involves raising hands in surrender and praise. Tehillah describes spontaneous singing praise. Barak means to kneel in blessing. Each expression reveals different aspects of our relationship with God, from reverent awe to joyful celebration. King David, called a man after God's heart, demonstrates worship's many dimensions. He danced before the Lord with all his might, wrote profound psalms of adoration, and sought God's presence continually. 2 Samuel chapter 6 shows him worshiping with abandoned joy, unconcerned about dignity when expressing love for God. Yet he also penned deep contemplative psalms showing worship's intimate, quiet side. Worship involves both spirit and truth, as Jesus explained. The spirit aspect speaks to sincere, heartfelt engagement, not just going through motions. The truth component requires worship based on accurate understanding of God's nature and ways. One without the other creates imbalance. Emotional worship without truth becomes unstable. Truthful worship without spirit becomes dry religion. God's holiness demands reverence in worship. When Moses approached the burning bush, God commanded him to remove his shoes. He stood on holy ground. While we have bold access to God through Christ, we must never lose sight of His majesty. Contemporary worship sometimes becomes too casual, forgetting the one we approach is the consuming fire described in Hebrews chapter 12. Corporate worship carries special significance. While private worship remains vital, something powerful happens when believers worship together. Psalm 133 describes this unity as precious oil and refreshing dew. When the church in Acts chapter 4 worshiped together, the building shook and they received fresh filling of the Spirit. True worship also involves sacrifice. Abraham's greatest act of worship came when God asked for Isaac. The widow gave her last coins in worship. David refused to offer God sacrifices that cost him nothing. These examples show that authentic worship often requires giving up something valuable: our time, resources, comfort, plans. Worship reshapes our perspective. When facing armies, Jehoshaphat sent worshipers to the front lines. In prison, Paul and Silas worshiped at midnight. Job worshiped after losing everything. Through worship, circumstances that look like mountains from earth become molehills from heaven's perspective. It lifts our eyes from temporal problems to eternal reality. The pattern of worship set in heaven reveals its importance. Revelation shows continuous worship around God's throne, angels declaring, "Holy, holy, holy," elders casting their crowns before Him. This eternal reality should shape our earthly practice. We're not just singing songs. We're joining an eternal symphony of praise. Worship serves as spiritual warfare. When Paul and Silas worshiped in prison, chains fell off and doors opened. When Jehoshaphat's army faced overwhelming odds, worship preceded their victory. Something powerful happens in the spiritual realm when God's people worship. Psalm 8 tells us that praise silences the enemy and the avenger. Our worship also affects our transformation. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 18 reveals, "We become like what we behold." Time spent worshiping God, focusing on His character and nature, gradually transforms us into His image. This explains why devoted worshipers often reflect God's characteristics. They've spent time gazing upon Him in worship. The offering of worship must be costly to be meaningful. King David understood this when he declared in 2 Samuel chapter 24, "I will not offer to the Lord my God burnt offerings that cost me nothing." True worship often requires sacrifice of time, comfort, resources, or pride. The more it costs us, the more precious it becomes. Many believers misunderstand the role of music in worship. While music provides a powerful worship expression, it's just one channel. Scripture shows people worshiping through service, giving, obedience, and silence. A mother changing diapers for God's glory worships just as truly as a singer on stage. A businessman making ethical choices for God's honor worships through his decisions. Worship also involves our minds, not just our emotions. Romans chapter 12 verse 1 calls it our reasonable service. The word reasonable relates to our minds, thinking, rational worship. While emotions play a part, genuine worship engages our intellect as we meditate on God's attributes and works. The fruit of authentic worship manifests in changed lives. It should affect how we treat others, handle resources, and make choices. James chapter 1 warns about those who claim to worship but don't care for widows and orphans. True worship overflows into practical obedience and service to others. The essence of worship extends far beyond Sunday services. It encompasses every moment we choose to honor God with our lives. Whether in grand cathedrals or quiet bedrooms, busy offices or crowded streets, true worship flows from hearts captivated by God's worth. As we grow in worship, we discover its transformative power. Problems that once overwhelmed us shrink in the light of God's greatness. Decisions that confused us find clarity as we acknowledge His wisdom. Burdens that weighed us down lift as we enter His presence through praise. Remember, God isn't impressed by outward displays alone. Isaiah chapter 29 speaks of people who honor God with their lips while their hearts remain far from Him. True worship bridges this gap, aligning our hearts, minds, and actions in genuine devotion to God. Have you experienced the transformative power of worship in your life? How has genuine worship changed your perspective on circumstances? Share your experiences in the comments below. Your testimony might inspire others to discover deeper dimensions of worship. If this teaching has expanded your understanding of worship, don't forget to like this video and share it with others seeking to worship God more authentically. Subscribe to our channel, Blessed by Jesus, for more teachings that deepen your relationship with God. Explore our other videos about spiritual growth and drawing closer to God. Together, let's discover the joy and power of true worship.